Trump has sent out a strong warning to China and North Korea. He says the U.S. is more than willing to tackle Pyongyang alone if Beijing doesn't take action. His remarks come a matter of days before he's due to meet with his Chinese counterpart in Florida. Here's Airirang's Connie Kim at the Foreign Ministry.
If China is not going to solve North Korea, the United States will. That was a short but strong message from U.S. President Donald Trump with regard to North Korea's nuclear weapons program, according to an exclusive interview with the Financial Times published Sunday. The president said China has great influence over the North and will either decide to help Washington with Pyongyang or not, adding it won't be good for anyone if China doesn't. When asked whether unilateral action would be successful, the U.S. president responded with a single word, totally. He declined to provide further details, telling the paper he didn't have to say anymore. Trump's comments come 4 days before he hosts Chinese President Xi Jinping at his private Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida, and the U.S. leader is expected to push Xi on the North Korea issue. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, told ABC in an interview broadcast on Sunday that Washington will press China to take a stronger stance on the North's nuclear program, saying that UN resolutions have failed to stop the North from conducting nuclear missile tests. The UN envoy said Beijing must take definitive actions as the only country that can halt North Korea's nuclear ambitions. Former Defense Secretary Ashton Carter, however, said he doubted Beijing will cooperate due to its unique historical and economic relationship with the North. Carter added that all options should be on the table when it comes to protecting the U.S., while also warning that a preemptive strike on the North could lead to a very destructive second war on the Korean Peninsula. Connie Kim, Airirang News.
P-8 aircraft and sonar technicians to track submarines and protect a high-value unit.
Submarines represent a major threat to surface vessels by virtue of the fact that they're difficult to find. And it really only takes one submarine firing one shot to really complicate our calculus, potentially sink a high-value unit like a carrier.
Somewhere, lurking in those waters hiding, is a submarine. And during the exercise, the U.S. are using a variety of assets to find it.
As a destroyer, I usually don't get the opportunity to be the anti-submarine warfare commander. And so this presents us an opportunity for us to grow tactically, to take that next step, the next level of warfare.
The different platforms play a game of cat and mouse, each trying to find the other first. The U.S. actively searching for their counterpart submarine.
They can hide easily because they're quiet. We're, I guess, the first defense, I guess, in like a war-like scenario against enemy subs. So if we aren't good at our job, chances are we're not going to make it.
We need at least 5 minutes.
South Korean authorities have seized a second ship they suspect of violating international sanctions by supplying oil to North Korea. Recently, tough UN sanctions were imposed banning nearly all of North Korea's oil imports in an attempt to curb ballistic missile tests. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has called on all nations to clamp down on the rogue regime, saying the U.S. has a right to, quote, interdict maritime traffic. But should the U.S. lead an actual blockade of North Korea? Some experts are saying that is a solution to bringing Pyongyang to heel, as it displays a new so-called nuclear button and yet another threat. Joining me now to discuss, former Green Beret and Fox News contributor Michael Wall. It's great to see you tonight.
Thanks, Shannon.
Okay, so I want to start by a piece that was an opinion piece on FoxNews.com from a retired lieutenant commander from the Navy, Gregory Keeley. He says this, short of a naval blockade where every ship in the vicinity of North Korea is boarded, searched, and if necessary, impounded, it will be impossible to entirely close the oil lifeline spigot. Is it a realistic solution to this issue?
Well, big picture, President Trump must consider, and this is an important part of it, every option on the table short of the military option, because so much is at stake there. So what would a naval blockade seek to accomplish? Well, basically two things. One, to stop the inflow coming into North Korea of oil and gas and anything that could benefit its nuclear program, the machinery or any raw materials, and then the export, in particular with North Korea, of its textiles and seafood, where it gets a lot of hard currency. But operationally, it would be incredibly tough. It would seriously tie down our Pacific Fleet, specifically the 7th Fleet based out of Japan, and it's the 7th Fleet that already lost 2 ships this year, the McCain and the Fitzgerald, to those collisions that we remember talking about. So I'm not, it would have to be part of an overall strategy. I still would like to see us absolutely focused on China and choking off and encouraging the Chinese to choke everything off the North Koreans. Remember, they still have a very long land border with North Korea. They have an oil pipeline, and what we'd risk with a blockade is that we tie down our Pacific Fleet while the Chinese are still supplying the North Koreans, because to them it's more of our problem than it is a Chinese problem.
Yeah, they've got to be made to feel like it is in their best interest to act in a way that is negative, has a negative impact on North Korea. By the way, North Korea, its state media outlet said this about the possibility of a naval blockade. They said, should the U.S. and its followers try to enforce the naval blockade against our country, we will see it as an act of war and respond with merciless self-defense countermeasures, as we have warned repeatedly. That sounds pretty much like the response we get to them from just about everything we do.
Yeah, well, that's right. But in this case, a blockade is considered, historically an act of war by most countries. The other piece here, though, is an authorities issue. We would need a UN sanction specifically authorizing the use of force. Right now, what the UN authorizes is an inspection regime, and that's fine, and we're starting to do that. We're certainly seeing the South Koreans do that. But if a ship doesn't comply, we are not authorized to actually use force to get it to comply. So we would have to go back to the UN for additional authorities. And again, what we would risk, at the end of the day, I think I would like to see us try a blockade before we go to the final military option, but we do risk also a slow escalation at sea, and we could risk losing the benefit of surprise by a precision strike on the nuclear program and on the leadership. So a lot for the president to consider here.
Yeah, you talked about China. We know Russia is also a factor here as well.
Absolutely.
How do those who believe North Korea is a threat to them, how do they convince China and Russia it's in their best interest to get involved in a more substantive way?
Well, what I think at the end of the day we have to do is make the Chinese, in particular, the Russians to a lesser degree, start feeling the pain and making this part of their problem. How would we do that? Well, one, we can authorize and work with the Japanese to go offensive. Their constitution right now prevents that in terms of their military. Reintroducing tactical nuclear weapons into South Korea, which we had up into the 1990s, and a number of other things in terms of introducing more advanced missile defense and more advanced radars, to the point where the Chinese see the security dynamic drastically shifting against them in Asia, and they say, you know what, North Korea, you're more of a problem than you're worth, and we're finally going to take drastic action here.